They laughed when the old man fell face first into the sand, his battered armor splitting at the seams and a dull clang ringing out across the silent arena. One of the lords snorted and called for a broom, saying they might need it to sweep up whatever dust was left after the first blow. Bets exchanged hands in a flurry, not on whether he would win, but on whether he would survive the first 10 seconds. The chains around his wrists dragged deep lines in the dirt as he struggled to stand, a pathetic sight even under the twin suns. Yet when he raised his head and the light hit the cracked mask he wore, something cold and ancient stirred in the pit of every seasoned fighter's stomach. They could not explain it, but their bodies knew long before their minds did. This was no relic. This was a storm pretending to be a corpse. The Galactic Lords lounged on their thrones high above the arena floor, sipping glimmering liquors and flicking golden tokens at their slaves. To them, this was entertainment at its finest, a display of dominance and superiority. In their arrogance, they had sent scouts to the wastelands of Tiran 9, a planet long forgotten by the progress of the stars, hoping to dig up artifacts for their private collections. What they had found instead was this: a man buried beneath the shifting dunes, encased in rust and legends. His armor was no gleaming suit of nanotech plating. It was stitched leather, bent iron, faded cloth. It was a joke. Or so they thought. The announcer's voice boomed across the stadium, mocking in its ceremony. Today's first fight, he said, would feature the relic against one of the arena's prize champions, a genetically sculpted warrior named Zothar, built from the DNA of 7 predator species. As Zothar stomped into the ring, flexing claws that shimmered with plasma heat, the crowd erupted in cheers. A few among them, those old enough to remember the true horrors of history, sat uneasily, frowning at the insignia barely visible on the old man's shoulder, a faded, almost erased mark of a spiral wrapped around a single blade. Zothar wasted no time. The arena gates had barely clanged shut before he launched forward, a mountain of muscle and teeth. The old man stood perfectly still, dust swirling around his boots. The lords leaned forward eagerly, eager to see the antique crushed into the sand. When Zothar struck, it was with the force of a landslide. But somehow, impossibly, the old man wasn't there. The chain fell slack. A gust of sand rose. And Zothar screamed. For a heartbeat, nobody understood what had happened. Then they saw it. A thin line of red appeared across Zothar's thick neck, so precise it looked drawn on by an artist. The gladiator staggered, dropping to one knee, and then the life drained from his eyes as he collapsed forward into the sand. The old man stood a few paces behind him, a short, curved blade sliding back into a hidden sheath along his forearm. The crowd gasped. The lords barked orders to the overseers. This was not part of the script. Someone must have given the relic a hidden weapon. An investigation would be launched later. For now, rage covered their confusion. They ordered 3 more gladiators into the ring, fighters with heavy gauntlets and kinetic hammers, cybernetic limbs enhanced for war. Surely now the brittle old fool would crumble like the relic he was. As the gates slammed open again, the old man knelt slowly in the sand. He scooped a handful of it, letting it run through his fingers. The gesture was so casual, so deliberate, it drew an uneasy silence over the crowd. Then, with a sudden shift of his shoulders, he became motion itself, blurring into the fighters like a living ripple in the desert heat. The first gladiator swung a hammer down with enough force to crater the arena floor. The old man was already behind him. A flick of the wrist, a shift of the feet, the hammer wielder cried out, spinning wildly before collapsing as his legs gave out, cut in some unseen way. Another fighter roared and charged, a plasma spike extending from his wrist. The old man sidestepped, turned, and somehow the charging man stabbed himself in the shoulder, momentum and confusion rendering him helpless. The third, smarter than the others, backed away, holding his weapon in a defensive stance. He barked something into his comms, but before the words could finish, the old man disappeared into a cloud of kicked-up sand. In the next instant, he reappeared inches from the gladiator's throat. There was a dull thud, a gasp, and the fighter slumped to the ground, unconscious or worse. Above, the lords had gone still. Their grins had curdled into grim, tight lines. They exchanged glances, silent questions burning between them. How was this possible? How could something so old, so broken-looking, move with the grace of a shadow and the finality of death itself? In the lower stands, an old scholar wiped sweat from his brow. He alone among the crowd understood the terrible mistake the Lords had made. Long before the rise of the galactic empires, before the Lords ruled the stars, there had been orders of warriors, trained not with machines and enhancements, but with discipline, patience, and perfect, lethal skill. The Shinobi, whispered only in the oldest libraries, had been capable of defeating armies without ever being seen. They were not soldiers. They were not mercenaries. They were something far worse, assassins who could make death itself seem like an accident. And now, one of them stood here, alive when he should have been dust, moving with purpose that no enhancement could replicate, with a blade no energy field could predict. The crowd didn't understand the storm gathering under the twin suns. Not yet. They still shouted for more blood, thinking the Lords would surely bring out some creature or machine capable of crushing this strange opponent. But some instinct, deep and primal, had already settled into the arena sands, whispering to those who listened. This was not a fight. This was a warning. The old man straightened slowly, the cracked plates of his armor groaning as he moved. He looked up at the thrones of the Lords. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture that could have been a bow, or a challenge. Then he turned his back on them all, walking slowly to the center of the arena, where the blood from his enemies soaked the sand dark red. The crowd roared. The Lords clenched their fists. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of the arena, ancient mechanisms, untouched for centuries, shivered awake, sensing the return of a forgotten master. The storm had only just begun. The first gladiator's death had rattled the arena, but the second and third turned it into something worse, something the Galactic Lords hadn't planned for: silence. No roaring crowds, no drunken laughter from the balconies, not even the barked orders from the pit commanders could break the eerie stillness that fell over the sands. The Lords, for all their wealth and arrogance, had not known fear for a very long time. But it had a way of sneaking in, cold and sharp, especially when an enemy refused to follow the script. They had paraded the old man as a joke, a spectacle to open the day's blood games, and now he stood amid the broken bodies of their finest creations, his rusted armor creaking softly as he moved. It should have been comical. It was anything but. Determined to regain control of the spectacle, Lord Commander Vrax snapped his fingers at the overseers. "Send in 5, he growled, all armed with high-impact plasma whips and kinetic staffs. Not arena fodder this time, but the top-tier fighters reserved for high-paying games. The ones enhanced not just with muscle but with speed, reflex augmentations, vision beyond the normal spectrum. Warriors who could see a bullet split the air and dodge it. If anything could remind the audience who ruled the galaxy, it would be these elite gladiators." The gates ground open with a rumble, and 5 figures stormed into the arena, moving with a predatory grace, spreading out immediately to surround the old man. He did not move to meet them. He simply stood there, one hand loose at his side, the other resting lightly on the hilt of a short, jagged blade barely visible under his tattered cloak. The 5 circled him like wolves, communicating silently, their movements crisp and perfect. The lead fighter lashed out first, a feint high toward the head, while another darted low with a sweep meant to take the old man's legs out from under him. The combination had ended hundreds of matches before the first heartbeat. Yet somehow the old man was not where they struck. It was as if he stepped through the spaces between the attacks, his body shifting just enough to avoid every blow without wasting an ounce of energy. Then he retaliated, not with a grand strike, but with a flick of his wrist so subtle it was almost missed. A glint of steel. A gasp. One of the gladiators staggered back, clutching his side, blood spurting between his fingers. The crowd tried to find its voice again, but all that came out were confused murmurs. No flashy power moves, no explosive energy bursts. Just simple, deliberate violence. Efficient. Inevitable. One fighter after another lunged, striking with all the rage and fear that a cornered animal could muster, but the old man turned them aside with the grace of a man stepping over puddles in a rainstorm. He moved closer to the second fighter, and with a motion so quick it looked like a flicker of light, the fighter's arm twisted in an impossible angle, weapon falling uselessly to the ground. Above, the lords leaned forward, their perfect postures breaking. This was not the display they had ordered. Whispers spread among their ranks. Who had authorized pulling this relic from the sands? Where had he been hidden for so long? Someone was going to answer for this. But right now, the main question burned hotter than any of their fury. How were they going to stop him? In desperation, Lord Commander Vrak sent a new signal, one forbidden by the ancient arena codes but justified, he believed, by the threat unraveling before his eyes. Release the beasts. Not the caged monsters meant for staged hunts. No, the real ones, bred in the forgotten laboratories of Aren 5, spliced with DNA from predators that had wiped themselves into extinction. Beasts that weren't meant to be shown to the public except in controlled demonstrations. The arena gates groaned again, heavier this time, as massive forms lumbered forward. The ground trembled under their bulk. Six-legged abominations with jaws capable of tearing steel, eyes black and soulless, thick hides that deflected plasma rounds. The audience recoiled in their seats. Even the bravest among them knew they had crossed from sport into massacre. The old man, for the first time, lifted his head fully to regard the new threats. If he felt fear, it did not show. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, bending his knees, loosening his shoulders. And then something unexpected happened. Small compartments along his rusted armor popped open with soft clicks, revealing hidden weapons and tools. Smoke bombs the size of marbles tumbled into his palm. Tiny, wicked-looking needles, gleaming with some ancient toxin, slipped into slots along his forearm. As the first beast lunged, the old man exploded into action. A smoke bomb hit the sand with a puff, blinding the beast. Before it could clear the mist, a needle whistled through the air and embedded itself into the creature's exposed flesh. The result was immediate. The beast shrieked, muscles spasming violently, before collapsing with a heavy, shuddering thud. Panic rippled through the stands. The lords shouted down orders, some calling for shields to be raised around the viewing platforms, others demanding emergency guards to be dispatched. The second beast swung a tail the size of a hovercar at the old man. He leapt, catching the air in a way that seemed impossible for someone clad in such battered armor. The tail slammed into the arena wall instead, cracking stone and sending debris raining down on the crowd. A few lords scrambled from their seats, too proud to run but not foolish enough to stay put. The third beast charged straight into the center of the arena, roaring a challenge. The old man did not dodge. Instead, he rolled beneath its charge, planting 3 tiny explosive discs along its underbelly as he passed. When the beast turned to pursue him again, the discs activated, sending concussive shockwaves through its internal organs. The creature's eyes rolled back into its skull as it dropped, twitching once before falling still. The lords watched, trapped between fury and terror, as the last 2 beasts hesitated. Animals they were, but not stupid ones. They smelled death. They smelled a predator more ancient and more ruthless than anything bred in a lab. One backed away with a whimper. The other, larger and meaner, roared and attacked in blind rage. The old man sidestepped the beast's first lunge, climbed its body like a spider scaling a wall, and with a movement so fluid it seemed rehearsed, drove a short, jagged blade into the creature's skull behind its armored eye ridge. The beast shuddered, collapsed, and did not rise again. The audience was utterly silent now. Even the lords forgot to breathe. The sand, churned and bloody, no longer looked like a place of games. It looked like a graveyard. And the old man stood at its center, the battered remnants of his armor flaking away to reveal the scars and marks of hundreds of battles survived. He looked up once more at the high seats where the lords sat, and a faint movement twitched at the corner of his cracked mask. A smile, perhaps. Or maybe just a warning. The historian watching from the stands leaned forward, whispering the old words to himself, words meant for another age, another war. Beware the rusted blade, he murmured. It remembers how to kill even when the world forgets. The silence of the arena cracked under the weight of the lord's humiliation. Pride was a fragile thing among rulers who had built their empires on blood and spectacle, and nothing wounded deeper than public disgrace. Lord Commander Vrax, shaking with rage, leaned into the control console embedded into the marble railing before him. He slammed a fist against the surface, sending cracks spidering across the glass. Protocols or not, traditions or not, this was an emergency. With a voice that brooked no refusal, he ordered the commanders to prepare the warden-class soldiers. These were not gladiators. These were enforcers, built with no intention of entertainment, trained not to fight fair but to erase problems permanently. Their exoskeleton suits gleamed as they marched into position, heavy with shockwave cannons, graviton nets, and the kind of firepower that could reduce a city block to rubble in seconds. Surely no rusted relic, no matter how skilled, could stand against the full military might of the Lords. Below, the old man stood perfectly still, the storm of dust and blood around him settling slowly. He seemed almost serene, as if none of this chaos touched him. The watchers in the stands began to shift, a creeping dread rising in their throats. It was not the old man's armor or weapon that unsettled them now. It was the realization dawning in their minds that they had seen such things before, not in arenas, but in histories their parents had whispered about in terror. Legends of assassins who moved unseen through battlefields, of soldiers who needed no armies, only the shadows and their own silent resolve. The first warden soldier dropped from the hoverlift with a sonic boom that made the sand leap from the ground. His suit shimmered with energy shielding, and his cannon arm locked onto the old man with cold mechanical precision. A warning shot vaporized a boulder 10 meters to the warrior's right, kicking up a plume of white-hot sand. The message was clear. Surrender or be annihilated. The old man neither surrendered nor ran. He moved forward, unhurried, as if strolling through a garden rather than a death trap. The warden barked a final command for compliance. Then he fired. The blast cracked the air, screaming toward the figure like a miniature star. But at the last possible instant, the old man twisted. Not a wild dodge, not a desperate dive. A simple, measured movement, enough to slip past death itself. The shot slammed into the arena wall behind him, detonating in a burst of force that rattled the entire structure. Before the warden could recalibrate, the old man was there. No sound, no warning. Just a blur of motion and a flash of rusted metal. With a deafening clang, the warden's cannon arm dropped to the ground, severed at the joint. Sparks flew as the enforcer staggered back, his system screaming alerts into his helmet. The old man didn't hesitate. He leapt up, using the warden's own body as a springboard, vaulting high into the air. Mid-spin, something clicked on his belt, and tiny explosive charges launched from hidden compartments, embedding themselves into the backs of the other warden suits now rushing into the arena. By the time they realized it, it was too late. The charges detonated with surgical precision, disabling propulsion systems, slicing power feeds, turning the Lord's elite enforcers into lumbering, confused targets. The old man landed lightly, almost gently, as though gravity itself had agreed to ease his fall. He rolled once, then stood, facing the stunned remnants of the warden unit. One raised his graviton net launcher and fired, the web of collapsing force meant to ensnare and crush. But the old man caught the net midair with one hand and twisted, flipping it back onto the shooter. The warden was instantly wrapped in his own trap, crushed under the weight of his collapsing suit. Above, the lords were no longer giving orders. They were shouting at each other, blaming each other, demanding explanations. Who had authorized this artifact's retrieval? Who had failed to scan for biological anomalies? Who had dared to ignore the historian warnings that littered the archives? Accusations flew faster than the commands to kill the relic. But no command mattered now. No amount of soldiers, no level of technology seemed to halt the slow, deliberate path of destruction that the old man carved through their pride. A few of the younger lords, less disciplined than their seniors, reached for their personal defense drones, activating swarms of lethal machines programmed to eradicate biological threats. The drones swirled into the arena in a lethal cloud, a black mist of death. The crowd gasped, a few faint-hearted ones even bolted for the exits, their instinct for survival finally overwhelming their all. But once again, the old man moved before thought could catch up. From his armor, he unleashed a burst of signal-disrupting chaff, scrambling the drones mid-flight. The mist of machines turned chaotic, spinning into each other, detonating harmlessly in the upper atmosphere of the arena. Now the lords understood something too late. They had not dragged a relic into their games. They had unearthed a ghost, an echo of an era when men and women did not wear armor because they were weak but because they chose the tools of patience, stealth, and inevitability over brute force. The old man was not a fighter who could be bought or threatened. He was a weapon sharpened by time itself, and they had handed him the stage. Lord Commander Vrax, his face purple with fury and terror, gave the ultimate order, one that had not been spoken in 1,000 years. Collapse the arena. Kill everything inside. It was a coward's command, but in that moment, none of them cared for honor. Survival was the only thing left. Engineers scrambled, activating ancient failsafes buried deep in the foundation. The sand beneath the old man's feet began to shudder. Stone cracks spidered across the arena floor as hidden explosives primed to detonate. The old man tilted his head once more, listening. He seemed to feel the vibration before any visible signs appeared. Without hurry, he crossed the arena, each step calculated, each movement deliberate. The lords watched, frozen in disbelief, as he traced a path toward one of the ancient pylons that framed the center of the arena. An artifact from a forgotten civilization, left in place even as the arena was built around it. A pylon that wasn't just a decorative ruin but something much older and far more dangerous. He placed a hand on its surface, pressing a sequence of points along the etched stone. Ancient runes flared to life. The ground's shuddering intensified. Not from the Lord's explosives, but from something older, deeper. Mechanisms groaned awake beneath their feet, systems that had lain dormant for countless generations. Systems that answered not to lords, but to the ancient orders who had once ruled the shadows of galaxies. The arena didn't explode. It folded in on itself. Sections of stands collapsed with shocking precision, walls crumbled inward like a flower closing at night. Stone and steel bent as if pulled by invisible threads, reshaping the space not into ruin but into a tomb. The lords scrambled away from the edges, their guards abandoning them in panic. The spectators fled, trampling each other in their terror. The ruins of the once great arena smoked under the twin suns, casting long, broken shadows across the blood-soaked sand. The few lords who managed to flee stumbled into their waiting transports without ceremony, without dignity, their grand robes torn and dusty, their once immaculate faces carved with fear. In the distant sky, ships circled uncertainly, their pilots hesitant to land too close to the chaos. The surviving crowd, commoners and minor nobles alike, spread stories faster than any official report could suppress them. Whispers passed from lip to trembling lip, traveling across sectors by the hour. They spoke not of the Lord's spectacle, not of their power, but of the old man who moved like a ghost and left ruin in his wake. The relic in rusted armor had become something far worse to them than a myth. He had become a warning. Back in the shattered arena, beneath the broken pylons and fractured seating, the Lord's engineers worked feverishly to retrieve what they could from the carnage. Black boxes, security logs, surveillance footage, anything that could explain how a single forgotten human had dismantled their might so completely. Every recording told the same story, but none offered an answer. No energy signatures matching known weaponry, no enhancement readings matching known technologies. He fought with no shields, no armor amplifiers, no cybernetic aids. Just movement, precision, and something deeper, something older than science. Fear crept into the data analysts' voices as they prepared their reports. If one still existed, how many others might be sleeping in the forgotten corners of the galaxy? Meanwhile, in the upper halls of the Lord's Council chamber, chaos reigned. Lord Commander Vrax, stripped of his titles by panicking peers, argued furiously with anyone who would listen. It wasn't his fault, he insisted. He hadn't authorized digging up relics from ancient tombs without proper research. His words, once enough to command armies, now fell on deaf ears. Power shifted like sand in a storm. New alliances formed in whispers. Old friendships dissolved into suspicion. Every lord knew one truth above all: weakness invited enemies. And today, the galaxy had seen their weakness. Desperation birthed dangerous ideas. In the dark, smoke-filled backrooms of the council, a plan took shape. They would not admit their failure publicly. No, they would create a new enemy, a greater threat, one the people would fear more than the old warrior. They would spin a narrative of an ancient terrorist, a remnant of a barbaric past threatening the new order of peace and prosperity. They would declare martial law, justify new expansions of their authority, and in doing so, root out whatever hidden cells this ghost might inspire. If they moved quickly enough, they could turn this defeat into a consolidation of absolute power. But they were already too late. Far from the crumbling remains of the arena, beyond the reach of the Lord's desperate broadcasts and propaganda, the old man moved like mist across the barren lands. He had discarded the last shattered pieces of his armor, trading them for a simple cloak of coarse fabric. His weapons, stripped and repaired, hung hidden within the folds of his garments. Every step he took was deliberate, every movement calculated. He was not fleeing. He was hunting. He made his way to a place forgotten even by the historians who had feared him. Deep within a canyon split by time and erosion, he found it, a temple carved into the living rock, its entrance hidden by layers of dust and sandstorms that had wiped entire settlements from the maps. Once, long ago, this temple had been a training ground for his kind. A crucible where warriors were not just taught to fight, but to endure, to think, to become forces of nature rather than men. Time had worn it down, but as he stepped inside, the ancient mechanism stirred faintly, sensing one of their own returning. The old man moved through the corridors, brushing his fingertips against the faded murals. Scenes of long-forgotten wars, of battles won not with armies but with single, decisive strikes. Of great powers brought low by patience and silence. His journey took him to the heart of the temple, a chamber where the stones still pulsed faintly with energy. There he knelt, laying his blade before him, bowing his head in silence. Dust settled around him, the only sound the faint crackling of old systems remembering their purpose. He stayed there, unmoving, for what felt like hours. Then, as if answering a summons from beyond the stars, others began to arrive. First one, then another, until half a dozen figures stood in the chamber's shadowed corners. Like him, they wore no uniforms of empire, no badges of rank. Their clothing was plain, functional, worn. But their eyes held the same sharpness, the same quiet certainty. Survivors of the old orders. Warriors who had hidden, who had waited, who had passed their teachings down through whispers and careful training. The lords had forgotten them, and in forgetting, had sealed their own doom. No words were exchanged. They needed none. Each knelt in turn, laying their weapons before them, reaffirming their oaths not with ceremony, but with action. The old ways lived on, carried not in banners or songs, but in the blood and bones of those who refused to surrender to the passage of time. Back among the lords, the council's emergency broadcasts flooded the systems, warning of insurgent threats, issuing rewards for information leading to the capture of the arena assassin. Propaganda beams lit the skies, promising swift justice, new laws, and greater security measures. Patrol ships combed the trade routes. Surveillance drones darkened the cities like flocks of iron crows. But fear cannot be contained by words, and lies cannot repair broken pride. Across the stars, small groups began to whisper the truth. Not all warriors had been tamed. Not all assassins had been erased. The lords had declared themselves gods, but gods could bleed, and today, they had bled in front of the galaxy. For every attempt to silence the story, another 3 would take its place. For every face the lords plastered on wanted lists, another would slip through the cracks. The old man and those like him moved quietly, not seeking battle, not yet. Their war would not be fought with fleets and bombardments. It would be fought in the hearts of the people, in the slow erosion of fear, in the quiet rebellion of memory. A shadow war, where every ally gained and every secret learned would be another stone in the foundation of a future no lord could rule. High above the ruins of the arena, a single torn flag caught the wind, spiraling upward before vanishing into the bright, merciless sky. Below, in hidden places across the galaxy, the Shinobi prepared. They would strike not for revenge, not for glory, but because the galaxy had grown soft, arrogant, blind to the lessons of its own history. They would remind it. And the lords, trembling in their golden towers, would learn the oldest lesson of all: those who forget the blade are always the first to feel its edge. In the cold reaches of the outer sectors, where the stars themselves seemed reluctant to shine, the whispers traveled faster than any ship. Merchants exchanged them over broken cups of synth wine. Soldiers muttered them in dark corners of barracks, glancing over their shoulders as if the walls themselves might listen. Even the smugglers, men and women hardened by lifetimes of betrayal, lowered their voices when they spoke of the arena at Celeris, and the man who had walked out of death's shadow. His name, if he even had one, was lost to time. To the common folk he became known only as the Rusted Ghost, and his story spread not as a tale of fear, but of hope. Hope that the invincible lords were not invincible after all. Hope that somewhere, hidden among the dust and ruins of history, the old ways had survived and would rise again. The lords tried everything. They flooded the networks with images of the ghost, digitally enhanced to make him seem monstrous, to paint him as a relic of terror that threatened the peace of the galaxy. They offered riches, titles, even full planetary pardons for any information leading to his capture. They dispatched bounty hunters, soldiers of fortune, and cybernetic assassins into the wastes of 1,000 worlds. None returned. Some were found later, broken and babbling about shadows that moved too fast to follow, about traps sprung from nowhere, about eyes that watched from the stones themselves. Others simply vanished, their last transmissions cut off mid-sentence by static and silence. Among the commoners, a new sign began to appear, scratched into walls, burned into the sides of cargo crates, painted in simple charcoal on city ruins. A spiral wrapped around the blade. The old mark of the Shinobi, reborn not as a memory but as a warning. In the glittering palaces of the Galactic Core, the lords panicked behind closed doors. Every shadow became a threat, every unseen movement a potential assassination. They purged their own ranks, accusing each other of harboring sympathizers. Loyalty tests grew harsher, interrogations more frequent. In trying to root out the ghost they had awakened, they began to tear themselves apart. Meanwhile, the Rusted Ghost and his small band of survivors moved like smoke across the galaxy. They did not attack openly. They did not stage grand battles or topple cities. Their war was a different kind, patient and merciless. They sabotaged key communications arrays, sowing confusion among the lords' fleets. They dismantled supply routes, ensuring food shortages that bred unrest among the outer colonies. They whispered into the ears of governors and soldiers alike, convincing some to defect, others to hesitate just long enough for the lord's grasp to slip. They taught again the lessons the galaxy had forgotten: that fear could be a weapon, that precision could defeat power, that silence could conquer noise. In a dusty tavern on the rim of the Delvar sector, a young merchant leaned in close to an old smuggler, his voice barely above a breath. He asked if it was true, if the Shinobi really still existed. The smuggler, his face lined with scars and stories too painful to share, smiled a smile that was not kind. He told the boy that they had always existed. They had simply waited, hidden in the corners where the lords forgot to look, patient as the stars themselves. They were not an army. They were an idea. And ideas, once ignited, could not be killed by blasters or bombs. On the bridge of the flagship Imperator, Lord High Admiral Krev watched the latest reports with growing dread. Worlds that had once been models of obedience now simmered with rebellion. Cities flickered into darkness without warning, infrastructure crumbling without a single shot fired. It was like fighting a ghost. No enemy fleet to engage, no stronghold to bombard. Just a steady, relentless unraveling of control. Krev, a man who had once prided himself on crushing uprisings before they could breathe, felt something alien gnawing at his chest. Helplessness. In a final act of desperation, the lords convened an emergency summit. They would deploy the Void Cleansers, weapons so terrible they had been banned by treaty even among their own brutal kind. Planets suspected of harboring the ghost or his sympathizers would be sterilized, wiped clean of all life in a show of absolute force. Fear, they reasoned, would be their salvation. It was a mistake they would not live long enough to correct. The first world targeted was Vela Minor, a dust-choked mining colony with little strategic value, but rumored to have sheltered a Shinobi sympathizer. The Void Cleansers arrived, massive black obelisks descending from orbit, their hum audible even through the vacuum of space. But when the activation codes were transmitted, nothing happened. The devices remained inert. Confused, the commanders tried again. Still nothing. Then, one by one, the Void Cleansers exploded from within, the detonations surgical and contained, leaving the surrounding cities untouched. It was only later, in the ruins of the command ship's systems, that they found the message. Not an elaborate threat or demand. Just 5 words, written in an ancient Earth dialect. You were warned to remember. Panic turned to terror. The Lords had lost control not just of the people, but of their own weapons. They realized, too late, that the war was no longer theirs to fight. It was a war of erosion, of whispered warnings and invisible hands undoing centuries of tyranny thread by thread. The rusted ghost and his kin had no need for armies. The galaxy itself had become their battleground. In the hidden temple, deep within the canyon sands, the old man watched the shifting star maps flickering across ancient monitors. Each system that fell into chaos was marked, not with a beacon of victory, but with a simple, somber note. Another step. Another crack in the walls the Lords had built so high around themselves. His face, worn and lined by years beyond counting, remained still. This was not a triumph to celebrate. It was a burden to bear. He rose slowly, wrapping the plain cloak around himself once more. His companions waited, silent and steady, understanding without being told. The war would not end tomorrow. Perhaps it would not end in their lifetimes. But seeds planted now would grow into forests the Lords could not cut down. Stones dropped into ponds would ripple into waves that no fleet could hold back. Outside, under the ancient stars, the winds carried the old songs again. Songs of freedom, of forgotten heroes, of blades hidden in shadows and justice born in silence. The galaxy had slumbered too long under the boot of those who mistook fear for loyalty, cruelty for order. Now it stirred, restless, remembering itself. And somewhere, far beyond the maps, beyond the reach of the Lord's desperate, flailing grasp, a banner of a spiral and a blade fluttered in the wind, unseen but not unfelt. A signal that the rusted ghost and his kind had not vanished. They had simply been waiting, patient as stone, relentless as time itself. The Lords had dragged a warrior from the dirt to amuse themselves. They had found instead the vengeance of a forgotten world, wrapped in rust and shadow, smiling with the patience of mountains and the certainty of storms.